Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I think we have a very good episode for many people in the southern end of the whitetails range today. And this may be very specific to parts of Mississippi, but I would say in a lot of the deep south, we are going through some really severe drought, especially in Mississippi, the southwestern region. It is, I guess, Steve, we could say it's kind of crispy out there right now. And
yeah, the most recent drought map says it's exceptional.
Yeah,
the drought level is exceptional in parts of Mississippi, Louisiana, and there's really I'm gonna not disagree with you, but expand. I think there's drought all up the Midwest too, and that's why the Mississippi River is so low right now. And so I think we're cutting ourselves short saying this is just for people in the lower South, because there's drought other places too. But go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted. Good morning.
No, very good point, Steve. Thank you. So really, I guess the central topic we wanted to deal with was, and all this is based on where you're at and timing and rainfall you have received or have not received so far. But the bottom line is relative to food plots. And so we're dealing with so many people that planted either in September and a lot of people in October. And we really, Steve, around these parts haven't had a good rain in at least 6 weeks, in some places 8 weeks. And so we have a situation where some food plots, they germinated and maybe have died. We have some situations where, depending on when you planted, there wasn't enough soil moisture for even germination. And so we have a very special guest to talk us through this situation. We have Dr. Erick Larson. He is an extension specialist with MSU. And Erick, I may have your title wrong. I think maybe officially it's small grains specialist, but I would certainly say you're an expert in wheat and corn and crops like that. And we want, and to add a little street cred to Erick, he's also a big deer hunter, and he's always managing food plots. And so he and I are always talking about good food plots, good forages, what's going on. And on top of that, Erick, I'm having a real grandiose introduction for you. Steve, Erick just harvested a buck in Kansas, if I'm not mistaken, that was on the extreme right side of the bell curve. Extreme right side. It's not even a 1%er. I would say it's a 10th of a percenter. So he just harvested with his bow an exceptional buck. So with that, Erick, we would really like for you to give us a little bit of your story. I think you've been chasing this buck for several years, and you finally connected, and the photos you shared are absolutely astounding. So give us a little bit of background, your history with this buck.
Well, I definitely have a long history with this buck. I've been hunting him for at least 3 years, and hunting him on some family land in Kansas, and luckily he's made it through several seasons anyway. But I actually took a shot at this deer and had a poor shot on him 3 years ago, and picked him back up on game camera within 4 days or so, and he's lived a good life till I finally caught up with him last Saturday. But anyway, I've been picking him up on game camera, and being an out-of-state hunter, probably the hardest thing was trying to time my trip to a time when he was active and had some daylight visits and so forth. And I normally go out to Kansas and hunt sometime after after about a week into November, November 5th, November 8th, and I'll go out there and hunt for a week or so. And but of these last 3 years, I've got daylight pictures of this deer multiple days from about October 27th through November 2. So I planned my trip and made that trip this year during an earlier time frame. In fact, I also picked up this deer earlier this October, 3 days in a row, daylight pictures. But he moved and transitioned during the time period when I hunted him over these years, and actually hunted him on some very non-traditional land, basically cow pasture area, is where I ended up catching up with him and hunting him the most the last 2 years. But he's transitioned areas and had a very near miss last year where I was up in a tree and he was coming down a tree row and got up to within 10 yards of me, and while I picked up my bow, there was a doe a different direction that caught my movement and busted me basically, and the gig was up anyway, as they say, last year. But things worked out in my favor this year, and he came in an hour and a half before sundown and came right in, and I got a good shot and saw him go down, and just couldn't ask for a better experience anyway. And he's a super deer.
That's an understatement. Yeah, he's a super deer. Eric, have you gross/rough scored him yet? Oh, looks like you're trying to provide an image of a Boone and Crockett score sheet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah, he ought to go 120.
Yeah, we gross scored him at 202 inches and 3/8.
Wow.
Eric, how much of that are non-typical points? So how much do you estimate inches of typical frame and then another X amount of inches of non-typical points?
Yeah, the abnormal points were just a shade under 9 inches, 8 7/8.
So he's got 180 plus 190 inches of typical frame.
Yeah. Really big deer anyway. I was looking at it, with some of my buddies from Kansas that I grew up with, and obviously, that class of deer, if he wouldn't have had any abnormal points on his right side, he'd be way up there in the Kansas record books.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, when did you said you picked him up like 3 years ago, is when you kind of started the chase and started the journey. Do you estimate him when you first picked him up? Was he 3 or 4 or 5? So how old was he then, and now do you estimate?
Well, I'll have to run that past the expert when I get back to Mississippi, but I think he was 3 to 4 years old when I first started picking him up in 2020.
Congratulations! I can't wait to hear. I can't wait to get my hands on it. Pictures are fantastic, of course, but it's always more impressive when you have them in hand. So
yeah,
can't wait to look at the rack. Can't wait to look at the mandible, and we'll talk aging.
Okay.
Okay, Eric. Well, that was just that was a bonus that we got to talk about your buck. Really, what we want to get to here, the topic at hand, is in this specific case, we're dealing with drought, but also for many years in a row, I deal with situations as you where we might be dealing with moisture as well. Can't get in the field. We didn't catch the timing just right, and the plots are too moist to get a tractor in there. So, bottom line, the question is, for whatever reason, it's late. It's now November. and we need to replant. So I guess what I wanted to talk with you about is, at what point is all lost? At what point can we still get a food plot in the ground and expect some reasonable production and attraction? And what do you think would be the best forages if it's November and you're just now going to plant? What are some tips you would recommend?
Well, generally, my professional responsibilities are working with well, most people know me as a corn specialist, but I also work with wheat and small grains and do a lot with cover crops as well. And first of all, the answer for planting dates depends a lot on the geography of the state. As you go further north, obviously you'd like to plant a little bit earlier than what you need to down in the far southern part of the state. But we can plant wheat and small grains for grain production and successfully plant them, up until Thanksgiving time for sure, and much later than that in the southern part of the state. So it's very realistic that we can still plant if we need to during the month of November and clear on up till, probably December the 15th in the southernmost areas of the state, and get those cereal grains up and have something for a deer to forage upon during the course of the winter. And a lot of the growth will depend upon what type of temperatures and how cold of a winter we actually have. And that obviously can vary from year to year. We can have, a really cold, extravagant snap like we did last year, or like what we normally have is, cooling temperatures that drop off, that reduce the growth once we get into the winter. But really the growth of those small grains or even other species rarely even goes completely dormant during the winter like you would in further north states.
Would you recommend, if you're planting late in November, let's just say mid-November, would you discourage people from planting oats and only favor, say, wheat and rye? Not ryegrass, cereal rye. And I know that is an it depends situation, because it's going to depend on temperature. If we end up having a very mild November and December, then oats will fare very well. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of feedback from last year's freeze. Certainly, we found that cereal rye is by far the most winter hardy of the cereal crops. Triticale, which is a cross between rye and wheat, was very close. And then came wheat, and oats were the worst of the cereal grains. Now, keep in mind, I guess, when we compare the cereal grains to legumes, even oats, which is widely recognized as having the least winter hardiness of all the cereal grains, was better than any of the legumes, or certainly the brassicas, rape and turnips and other brassica species. So in general terms, obviously oats was the least winter hardy, but it was better than all the legumes. In terms of deer preference, obviously there's some differences. Oats are probably the most favored from my experience, but cereal rye will produce more growth during the fall, and is probably the most growthy of those species. Wheat is probably the least, but we're talking about relatively small differences between the different species in terms of growth differences. They're relatively similar until you get into the spring and they break dormancy, around the 1st of March or whenever that is in your area of the state.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, you said regarding cold tolerance that oats, as a lot of people have experienced, oats would be the least cold tolerant. But even with that severe freeze we had, even oats outperformed the legumes.
Yes, it did in terms of cold tolerance. In a lot of our plots, or the average, about 60% of the oats survived, and the legumes, where we had, the less than 10 degree temperatures last year, about the best species was Balanza clover, and it's survival was, 50% or less.
Gotcha. Okay, Eric. So, what I've been recommending, people have been reaching out with this question, and this may be a very simplistic approach, but I'm a simple-minded person, so this is what I've been saying. I have been saying if now you are starting, you have considered your existing food plot a failure, and you're going to plant again, is that your best bet is to go with cereal grains. Make sure you're heavy on the cereal grains. If a consideration is you want biomass production during November, December, January to attract deer to your food plot. The legumes, and we keep saying legumes, and primarily we're talking about clovers, is that the clovers are probably not going to produce because it is so late in the year and because of temperatures. The clovers are likely not going to produce a lot of biomass during the hunting season to be really attractive, but they are going to provide a lot of nutrition come springtime. So if you're looking at your cool season planting as, I want it to be attractive during hunting season, but I'm also wanting to provide that additional nutrition during springtime, go ahead and add those clovers. Not going to do a lot for you during deer season, but come springtime, they're going to rebound and do well. Am I on the right track with that recommendation?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And I would add to that, I would generally add the legumes for nothing else, besides the deer nutrition. They have the ability to fix nitrogen, and that is extremely important for the nutrition of those cereals and to enhance their growth during the wintertime and provide a complementary growth to that cereal plant that you're really looking to ramp up, since you do have a late planting situation, if that's the situation you're in.
You brought up another topic there I wanted to explore. Are there any differences now with your soil amendments, meaning fertilization? Is there anything like with your cereals? Are you wanting, because you're planting so late and you want to ensure that you're getting growth as soon as possible, are you doing anything with the nitrogen? Or if you're coupling it with a clover, are you just assuming that the fixation from the clover is going to be sufficient nitrogen for your cereals?
I think generally, if you're mixing it with the legume, it will provide enough nitrogen to stimulate that plant productivity during the wintertime or even during the springtime. It'll basically take care of itself. But yes, that's the first fertility component that we typically think of to stimulate production is nitrogen. But I would add, I guess, that that's not the only nutrient. We need to take care of our soil fertility, and obviously we always recommend taking soil samples and addressing whatever is the most limiting nutrient or the most limiting factor. And generally the soil tests do an excellent job of characterizing what your limiting factors are. It may be potassium, it may be phosphorus, it may be a low soil pH, or something else that needs to be amended, maybe a micronutrient or a secondary nutrient for that matter. But having a balanced nutritional program that is high in fertility overall is probably the most important thing. And, the agricultural folks that I work with understand the basics of that. But, when we move to the wildlife food plots, I guess we have a different clientele in some regards. And for that matter, some folks, just overlook, I guess, the need for, the science behind soil fertility and don't soil test their food plots as much as they would their ag fields, or what we would like to do from a recommendation standpoint, being able to address those limiting factors. So certainly I would encourage you to do so. And if you need help, obviously you can contact myself or the county agent in any of the counties around the state to assist with that.
Is that the biggest mistake you see, Eric? Is it they're getting the species profile and composition okay, they're getting the seeding rate okay, but it's the amendments and the fertilization? When you're dealing with people and they're not having optimal production, is that the typical problem?
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a big player for sure. The other thing that I've seen beyond the fertility side is maybe getting the species selection up to speed, you might say, or consistent with what the culture is of your wildlife food plots. And you know this, I guess, because you've worked with these species for a long time and have a lot of experience with it. But I see a tremendous difference in the different legume species and the different clovers in terms of their adaptability and ability to survive and thrive in different soil types. With the high rainfall that we have in the South, you've got some species that do well in a wet environment, some of them that do well or really require a drier environment. So you see a lot of differences, I guess, in adaptability and how well those different species will thrive dependent upon what type of culture that you're planting into.
So what is your, in all your experience and evaluation, can you give us your recipe, species composition, planting rate, etc.?
First of all, you've got a cereal grain component, whether that be any of these species that we've talked about, and you've got cereal rye, you've got triticale, you've got wheat, you've got oats, and even, in the cover crop world, there's black oats, or you could use common oats or bob oats as well. There's really not a lot of physiological difference between those two in terms of what you'll see in the field in terms of growth and productivity. So you've certainly got those as your backbone, along with a clover species to provide that nitrogen, provide that nutrition and growth. And frankly, there's some other advantages associated with some of the clovers that reseed relatively naturally if you allow them to do their thing and go to seed during the summertime and then manage those plots during the late summer and fall. Oftentimes I have, a full crop of legumes that are ready to come back before I put a plow in the field, or I've got wildlife food plots I don't even plow basically. So by managing the summer annual species and other species that creep into those plots and do their thing during the summer and get them out of the way, a lot of these reseeding legumes and so forth will come back naturally, and then you just need to overseed with, whatever you need to supplement them, as well as the cereal species. The seeding rates can vary dependent upon your planting method. If you're planting with a drill or something that has precision planting where you're planting it in the soil, you can lighten your seeding rate. Or if you're broadcasting those cereal grains, and that's what I do primarily, is broadcast the cereal grains on top of ground that's either prepared or even no-till. And obviously you need to increase your rate a little bit there, but generally we're talking about seeding somewhere up around 90 to 120 pounds per acre, or even a little bit higher if it's some no-till ground that you can't prepare or don't have physical capability to get a disc or some other implement into the field to prepare that soil.
And of course, it's just going to depend on the type of legume. In this case, the clover. The seeding rate is going to be very species specific for that.
Absolutely.
Large seeded versus small seeded. Erick, one thing I see a lot, recommendations, is that a lot of people on the food plot side, not the agriculture side, they will recommend a white clover in the mix with no intention at all of managing it perennially. And I've always thought, and maybe someone's just evaluating cost when they're buying seed. I'm just going to throw in some white clover. Have you ever seen that? And do you have any, I guess, scientific justification for recommending that or discouraging that? I very simply just see it as, why am I going to plant a perennial clover in a plot that's going to be managed annually?
That's correct. Generally, the perennial clovers will have less growth. If you're looking for a winter food plot, something to provide forage for the deer during hunting season, that would be the least productive of your options. Any of the annual clovers will generally come up and produce more biomass or more fall growth during hunting season and be more productive. I've used white clovers in the past where I'm, specifically managing for turkeys and trying to keep, a nice, relatively low growth spring crop that turkeys will like to come out there and bug in and do their thing and spend some time in. But otherwise, as far as, from a cover crop standpoint or a wildlife food plot standpoint, the perennial species would be low on the totem pole as far as favorability.
Well, Steve, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about some other issues to consider and managing habitat to buffer. So I know I've been kind of talking a lot. So how about some input from your angle?
You're the plant food plot guy, so you've been having a good time talking with Erick. And Erick, really what we're talking about here is a special case of environmental variation that is present. We're talking specifically exceptional drought in parts of Mississippi and Louisiana and pockets elsewhere in the country. But really, as a food plot manager, you have to deal with some sort of variation most years. That's what variation is all about. And, right now in the areas of Mississippi, they haven't had rain in months. But then those same areas could be too wet in the spring to plant warm season food plots and might be flooded and just can't get in and plant anything in the summer until things dry out. So do you have a philosophy that you could share about dealing just with the whole range of stuff that land managers have to deal with? Too wet, too dry, too cold, too something.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'll address exactly what you're looking for, but Bronson mentioned something earlier about replanting. I would not assume just because my plots have not come up that they're not going to be successful or that they're not going to come up as soon as rainfall comes at some point this fall. We know that we're going to get some rainfall at some point in the South, and if the plots haven't come up because it's too dry and you haven't got a germinating rainfall that they're struggling with, or that they came up and they died or had some issues associated with the abnormal environment, you may not have to do anything, basically. If the seed is still out there and still viable, when the rain does come, it probably will germinate and everything will be fine. I mean, the plants and seeds have a way of taking care of themselves like that. And as long as we haven't gotten a little wild card, I guess, or gotten a small rain to germinate some of it and had some other issue, I guess, where they haven't survived, then we may still be perfectly fine.
I know I've been surprised in the past, Steve, where, and keep in mind, at least in our part of Mississippi, central Mississippi, October is the driest month. So year in, year out, that is on average where we have the lowest amount of rainfall. So we're dealing with October being very dry. And I know numerous times I have gone to our plots in November and shake my head and think it's a complete failure and we need to replant and, the sky is falling. And then the very next week we get a good rain and you go back out there and you have germination. And then you get into December and it looks like you never had a problem at all. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Erick, because I've seen that firsthand. A lot of worries we also have, Erick, probably not going to be an issue if you're drilling, but we call it seed depredation from birds and or sometimes small mammals. Yeah. Is you got that plot out there and all you're seeing is soil, dirt. You're not seeing much growth at all. And then, normally you love seeing turkeys on your property. But, you'll see a flock on that plot day in, day out, or every other, then you'll see a flock of a murder of crows out there and birds, and you just think they have completely, eaten every bit of seed. And that's another case of I'm always positively surprised come December where we have a pretty good stand and it's not a failure.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, do you ever, relative to the whole idea of this variation topic, do you ever look at some of the weather pattern predictors? Like we hear a lot about El Nino and La Nina affecting weather, rainfall levels in the South. Do you ever look at those and kind of use those to kind of predict what you might tweak your recipe for a given year because it's going to be a dry or a wet winter? Do you ever use any of those? Or do you just go with this is going to be my best bet, I'm going to do it year in, year out?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I'm thinking about my agricultural background in a way to answer that. Generally, we look at the cultural history, the long-term history, rather than short-term expectations. It seems like those short-term expectations are inconsistent. You might say it'd be a nice way to put it. At some point, it's the rain's going to come in Mississippi and it's going to be wet, and we can feel pretty strongly that these dry conditions are not going to persist, particularly once we get into December at some point. So, I would primarily manage upon staying the course, basically. If you need to supplement your food plots because of, depredation, like you just mentioned, or possibly some death of those species that may have come up or may have been planted in September and got a third of an inch on them, and part of them came up and either had pest or died. And I hate to say died. We usually overestimate how much plant death may occur because of drouthy conditions. And it really doesn't normally, we usually don't have just outright plant death. Usually if we have conditions that are conducive enough for germination, they'll put a good root underneath of them. They may not grow much, but they'll come up and be there until conditions get more favorable for growth, basically. So in general, I'd alter the management, either make a late seeding, maybe supplement where you've had some various birds, I guess, that have had some depredation, particularly those cereal grain seed that are larger and more attractive for them and easier for them to find, frankly, than, trying to find, I can't imagine that bird species or maybe other species may go out there and feed on Lancet clover seed or something like that. But being as small as it is, you wouldn't think that would likely be an issue, whereas they'll certainly find and forage on wheat and oats and triticale and cereal rye and those other larger seeded high energy type seeds that those species have. So, and then I would look at your fertility program. If you are exceptionally late planted and don't have a cereal out there, obviously putting a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer in the form of urea or some sort of a 34% nitrogen mix. I was going to say ammonium nitrate, but very few of our retailers actually carry real ammonium nitrate anymore, but they have some 34% fertilizer. But those nitrogen-oriented high concentration fertilizers, a low amount of those will provide all the nitrogen nutrition that those cereals could respond to and increase their growth over the winter time if you choose to go that route, particularly if you don't have a legume out there to complement those and provide that nitrogen that certainly they will be very responsive to.
Steve, I'm reminded of a story you told me many years ago that Al Brothers in South Texas provided to you and to a lot of people, but about, in this case, it was livestock, but dealing with drought. Can you, do you remember that story and can you share it?
Yeah, absolutely. And he applied it to deer too. His approach was, and South Texas is very droughty, and this was before, this was 30, 40 years ago in his peak experiences. He would say manage for the worst of conditions so that when it's better, the deer have some extra and really can show what they can do. Don't manage so that your deer population or livestock population are always pushing the edge of of forage quality and quantity. Back it down so that under the best in average years, you're golden. And ideally, when it's bad, you're not as bad as you could be otherwise. So manage for the worst, and then you're really going to appreciate it when you have it good or even average.
So this is probably the part, Steve, where we get an eye roll from some people, but where we again preach to people habitat quality,
Yep.
spending time in your woods, in your openings, making sure you're having those naturally occurring species. They are without a doubt more drought tolerant. And so you are going to be able to provide a forage base for deer in times like this. And then also keeping your deer density under control. And so, that's what we always recommend. And a lot of the times people, I'm guessing, would underestimate the value of that. But this is an example where if you already have that forage base, you don't have too many deer, the repercussions of food plot failure or food plots being really, really late is going to have a very diminished effect on your deer herd.
Yeah, and we certainly have compassion for people that can't manage their habitat. All they're allowed, they lease their land, and all they're allowed are the little loading dock food plots, and it's a challenging situation for them. But we always push that supplemental food plots are in fact supplemental to good habitat and population management. So hopefully our listeners won't rely just on some small area food plots for the nutritional status of their deer population.
So I guess keep the faith. I think Erick provided up. So glad he brought that up. That was something I failed to mention. Just because it looks bad now, it does not necessarily mean you have to go and completely replicate your planting. Just keep an eye on it, and day to day, week to week, look for germination. Make sure you don't have a failure before you go in and the expense of replanting. So just keep an eye on it. And one thing, Steve, I'm going to do is when we're done recording, I'm going to go ahead and turn in annual leave for the last week of October, first week of November. And I'm going to try to twist Erick's arm to figure out where exactly in Kansas he's located. And I'm going to go ahead and put in for my out-of-state license next year. I mean, Erick, you're not going to mind taking a couple of us with you next year.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Did he say absolutely not, he's not taking you, or absolutely not, he wouldn't mind?
Not very clear.
Yeah.
Not very clear at this point. Yeah. Okay. Anything else, Steve?
Well, I think it's a good day. It's we finally reached some cool temperatures down here in Mississippi, and it's time to get serious about getting out into the deer woods.
Get out there and get after them. That's exactly right. Well, Erick, congratulations. Really, really happy for you. Can't wait to hear more about the story and the journey, and can't wait to get my hands on that rack. That's going to be really, really fun. And I'm also going to be able to assess how well you scored the deer too.
Okay.
We're going to be able to tell if you always rounded up or not when you were taking your measurements.
Yeah, well, I didn't do the measurements, so I had one of my buddies do that. Yeah, and you'll get a kick out of how we did that. He came out and scored it in the back of a pickup on the way to the deer stand where he shot a buck that measured 169. And when he remeasured it the other night for real, the difference was an eighth of an inch between his very quick rough draft where I was putting numbers in the calculator while he was running the measuring tape, and the other night when we sat down and did it for real anyway.
All right. Can't wait to see it. Can't wait to hear the story. So appreciate you, Erick. Thanks so much for sharing the story. Thanks so much for sharing with me the latitude and longitude of where you harvested this buck. And no, seriously, we appreciate your time, Erick, and thanks for sharing your expertise. This is going to be really helpful, I think, to a lot of people. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just urge folks to not give up. Remember, I guess last year at Christmas time, basically our green food plots came to a screeching halt and had to regenerate or had some major deaths. So, if we do get some rainfall, we may be in better shape than what we were last year in a lot of regards.
Very good point.
Well, thank you, Erick. We appreciate you and taking time from your family and activities, and safe travels back.
Okay, thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed it.
Thanks a bunch, Erick. We'll see you soon. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we will also see you very soon.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.